Welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from a Frontier, and thank you kindly for stopping by. This morning it was raining, windswept, and I took this photograph at 6:51 a.m. and you could barely see the city from my office. And I must say I had an absolute blast last night at the Safaricom jazz concert. This is a fellow Kunle Ayo, guitarist, Nigerian. I'll put up a photograph I took of him as he came close to where I was sitting, and I'll put up another photograph that Wambui took of me dancing, and it really was a fabulous evening I had. And then finally another photograph I found, someone taking a photograph of me taking a photograph of Kunle, and I thought that was pretty cool as well. So I had a great time, I must admit, and fabulous guitarist, well worth listening to. When I went through YouTube, I couldn't find the music that he in fact played. So it's interesting, but beautiful. We've uploaded Dennis McCory's session at Mindspeak. Do have a look. It really was very powerful. I called it spare, minimalist, yet maximalist, in my view. And I'll put up a photograph, and he reminded me very much of Victor Hugo's comment, "It takes a dream to create the future." Olivier Blanchard, who's the chief economist of the IMF and whom I met when I visited Maputo earlier this year, concludes one of his notes with this comment: "The main policy lesson is a simple one: stay away from dark corners." That took me back to that piece I wrote about the new arrhythmic normal, and how His Excellency Johann Borgstam told me the signal announcing this new arrhythmic normal was the disappearance of MH370. I haven't put up that photograph I loved for a long time by Robert Frank, called The Road, New Mexico, 1955 to 1956, silver gelatine print. Kerouac describes this photograph as a long shot of night road, arrowing forlorn into immensities and flat, of impossible to believe America in New Mexico, under the prisoner's moon. Political reflections, and there's a lot going on. NATO summit, independent, is leading with the headline, President Obama's leadership under scrutiny as world looks to US for response to ISIS. Mr. Obama's competence as the leader, not just of the United States, but of the world, is under scrutiny as never before. At home, he has been criticized, even by some of his own supporters, for an approach that can seem bloodless and detached, sang-froid. After publicly responding to the murder 2 weeks ago of the first journalist James Foley, he went to play golf. Last week he said he didn't have a strategy yet for dealing with ISIS. The portrait of a president buffeted by world events he can neither control and seems sometimes confounded by is also starting to trouble some of America's allies, including Britain, likely to be the first country to which it will turn when it decides what to do. "We are looking for the leader of the free world to give a lead," one government minister said, asking not to be named. "So far, there is nothing." This has been a criticism of him for a long time, and I think it's his aloofness which lends itself to this. ITV News tweeted, "Tank parked on golf course outside venue for NATO summit in Newport, Wales." I'll put up that photograph. And then I go to Global Research, where in this article saying covert war was the strategy that Obama campaigned on, and he did. And he has been a very effective exponent of covert war, in point of fact, rather bloody as well. But in this article, and while he succeeded in getting fewer boots on the ground, the skies overseas are filled with swarms of drones and fighter jets. His no boots on the ground approach had an initial string of successes, especially regime change in Libya and successfully hunting the trophies of Osama bin Laden, Muammar Gaddafi, and many others that were assassinated without trial or evidence. The 2,400 plus civilians killed by these drones were dismissed as collateral damage in the US, though abroad they bred intense hatred and were successfully used by extremist groups like Al-Qaeda to attract recruits. Obama's covert strategy then hit a wall. His success in Libya is snowballing into an Iraq-sized disaster, having transformed the African nation with the highest standard of living into a living nightmare and a spawning ground for various regional conflicts. As Libya was plunging into chaos, Obama and his Gulf state allies sought to replicate this success in Syria. And then things got predictably worse. Obama gave the green light for his regional allies Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, Israel, Jordan, etc. to send weapons, fighters, bombing raids into Syria, which artificially extended the bloody war that would otherwise have ended long ago. And in fact, the cold-bloodedness of Obama is seen as there was a balance kept throughout this period, which would not have been kept had it was not enough to tip the balance, but it was enough to keep the balance. In both Ukraine and Syria, Obama's allies are getting their teeth kicked in. And when these allies scream for US direct military intervention, as happened in Syria and is now happening in Ukraine, Obama has been hesitant to pull the trigger, reversing his decision to bomb Syria last year. And you know why he did that. I think that was the right decision. I mean, Erdogan's fingerprints were all over that trigger event, and wavering over what to do in Ukraine. The dithering is what the US establishment is fed up with. They want military victories abroad by any means necessary. They're tired of Obama's failed covert wars. They are ready for the real thing. In practice, this means the Bush doctrine is coming back into style among US politicians. Good point. Then from there I jump to Jeffrey Goldberg, who makes the points that I would like to make. It is important to remember that Barack Obama is perhaps the greatest killer of terrorists in American history. And he refers to a memo that was taped to the wall of his office. It was from Donald Rumsfeld, the former Secretary of Defense, to Douglas Feith, then Under Secretary of Defense for Policy. It is dated 7th April 2003, shortly before Rumsfeld's mission in Iraq was so awesomely accomplished. The brief memo's subject line reads, "Issues with various countries." It opens, "We need more coercive diplomacy with respect to Syria and Libya, and we need it fast. If they mess up Iraq, it will delay bringing our troops home," Rumsfeld continues. "We also need to solve the Pakistan problem, and Korea doesn't seem to be going well. Are you coming up with proposals for me to send around?" Bloomberg is saying Putin is seen waging a Ukraine shadow war until veto assured. Vladimir Putin will continue a shadow war until he's created quasi-statelets in Ukraine's easternmost regions with veto power over the country's future, 5 current and former Russian officials and advisors said. Even after Putin and Petro Poroshenko agreed on steps to end more than 5 months of fighting, the Russian president won't settle for less than broad autonomy for Ukraine's mainly Russian-speaking regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, including the right to reject key decisions at the national level, such as joining NATO, according to the people. Putin is willing to wait until November, after Ukraine elects a new parliament and the heating season starts. That's key, to ensure his goals are met, in part by extending a natural gas cutoff to force a compromise if needed, one official said, on condition of anonymity, after speaking with Putin last week. Putin's goal is to force Ukraine to its knees. He wants a federal structure to put part of the country under Moscow's informal control and block NATO membership. The Ukrainian Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk said the plan is just window dressing before the NATO summit aimed at avoiding inevitable further sanctions. Putin plays a very calibrated game, and he's right about that. You'll often find he'll push it and then he'll step back in the face of a big set-piece event like this NATO summit. Ukrainian forces have been reeling from a series of reverses sparked by what they called a full-scale invasion by Russia last week. They've been getting pounded, I'm afraid. Prior to yesterday, the insurgents, backed by what Ukraine, the US and NATO say are Russian troops, intelligence, artillery and tanks, were closing in on the strategic port city of Mariupol on the Sea of Azov. In fact, I think they sucked them in and then hit them extremely hard. They also advanced on the airport in Luhansk, prompting the retreating Ukrainian army to blow up a runway after seizing Novoazovsk, a town on the Russian border. Ukraine's defense ministry puts the number of active Russian and rebel troops at 10 to 15,000. Ukrainian forces are clearly outgunned by the Russian aggressors. Without help, Russian troops can roll ever deeper into Ukraine. Point taken. And somebody else saying the West is afraid of a major war and Putin is exploiting that. The point is to frighten the West and Ukraine into thinking he'll take Kiev and change the map of Europe unless he gets what he wants. He's bluffing. In my opinion, picking a fight with Putin was pointless in the context of the pivot to Asia. And it's, I think, Nixonian that, in a world where although you have one overwhelming superpower, you have three hyperpowers. Or is it the other way around? I don't know. But the point is, it's 2 versus 1, 2 versus 1. And here it seemed Obama stepped into a situation of 1 versus 2. And I spoke of this before about Eastern Ukraine, ambiguous warfare, and how Eastern Ukraine has become a shadow zone. Interesting that Mail Online then reports, "This message is addressed to you, O Putin. ISIS now threatens Russia over its ties to Syria's Assad and promises to liberate Chechnya and all the Caucasus." Vladimir Putin was threatened because of close ties to Bashar al-Assad. In a video on Al Arabiya TV channel, an ISIS rebel sits in the cockpit of a captured Russian-made fighter aircraft in the Tabak area of the Syrian province of Raqqa. A second fighter warns, "This message is addressed to you, O Vladimir Putin. These are your aircraft which you sent to Bashar, and with the help of Allah, we will send them back to you. Remember this, and with permission of Allah, we will liberate Chechnya and all the Caucasus." What I find interesting about them is they seem to dislike absolutely everybody. The concept of order that has underpinned the modern era is in crisis. This is Henry Kissinger. The years from perhaps 1948 to the turn of the century marked a brief moment in human history where one could speak of an incipient global world order composed of an amalgam of American idealism and traditional European concepts of statehood and balance of power. But vast regions of the world have never shared and only acquiesced in the Western concept of order. These reservations are now becoming explicit. For example, in the Ukraine crisis in the South China Sea, the order established and proclaimed by the West stands at a turning point. And I wrote about this, saying the new normal is a very arrhythmic world. Pepe Escobar's headline in his latest piece is, "Once again, the battle lines are drawn, NATO versus SCO, NATO versus BRICS, NATO versus Global South, therefore NATO attacks." There is a very strong probability that he is dead. This requires verification on the ground, which is not simple. This is about Ahmed Abdi Godani, who, since we have not had any clear, definitive statement that he is dead. But I think he is. A hail of US missiles aimed at the leader of Somalia's al-Shabaab militants may have left a gaping hole in the group's leadership. Washington said it was still checking to see whether its laser-guided attack on Monday killed Ahmed Godani. A US government source on Wednesday said it was looking into a tweet from what it believed was a legitimate al-Shabaab account confirming the death. If confirmed, experts say there is a real chance the death of the man who ruled the group with an iron fist and left no obvious successors would trigger infighting or the formation of smaller, potentially more dangerous splinter movements. If he is in fact dead, it is a game changer in many ways for al-Shabaab. And somebody else saying this is a strategic ideology which cannot be destroyed by the elimination of an individual. And actually, I think decapitation, when Israel has been doing it for years, doesn't work. Some new leader steps in, quite often more extreme than the previous one. I'll put up a photograph of Ahmed Abdi Godani. Security experts say Godani acted as both a spiritual emir and tactical head of al-Shabaab. Barry, this El Jinni, current whereabouts in Syria is not known. His Twitter account under the name terrorist, it's El Jinni, has been deactivated. He of course kicked off the second second beheading with "I'm back, Obama, and I'm back because of your arrogant foreign policy towards the Islamic State, despite our serious warnings. So just as your missiles continue to strike our people, our knife will continue to strike the necks of your people," he said. And I found it quite spooky in his accent. And then they've interfered with his accent in the second video, with his voice. There's a spookiness about that. IS and the likes of al-Shabaab have proven accomplished and frightening and frightful exponents of the 21st century digital ecosystem. And what is so fascinating is that their media efforts all point west. The richest hunting ground for these new 21st century serial killers, terrorists, is among the disaffected in the Western world, folks who've emigrated there. This image caught my attention of displaced people queuing for food in the Central African Republic has won the ICRC Humanitarian Visa Door Award at the 26th International Festival of Photojournalism. And then I saw this photograph from somebody tweeting, I think they're both wives of the King of Swaziland. So I'll put that up. Tariq Ali asks what's going on in Pakistan, as do I, and concludes that the movement launched by Khan and Qadri is seen by many as being orchestrated by the secret state. It's aimed to destabilize the Sharifs and force them to resign. Khan's outburst against the Saudis for interfering in Pakistani politics was a result of Riyadh's open hostility to any attempt to remove Sharif. Currency markets, the euro was at 131.38. The euro-dollar touched 131.10 on September 2nd, and that was the strongest level for the dollar since September 6, 2013. So just shy of a one-year high. Dollar index 82.92. I'm bullish about that. Japanese yen 104.94. Remember, dollar touched 105.31, which was a Jan 10 high yesterday. Swissy 0.9190. Pound undercut by the vote in Scotland 164.50. Aussie 0.9334. Touched 0.9365 in point of fact. India rupee 60.46. South Korean won 10.1914. The Rial 223.69. Egyptian pound back to that 715 area, 715.19. South African rand 1069.36. The dollar has gained 1.3% in the past month. Euro has fallen 1%. The yen has dropped 1.2%. Dollar. I'll put up a 3-month chart. As I said on the 25th of August, in the old days, these conditions would have created a flight into the dollar. And interestingly, the dollar has been punching higher. I wrote, if things tip big, the dollar might soar, and I still think that's an outcome. Euro versus the dollar, I think that's going to break down below 130. I'll put up a 3-month chart of that. LVMH Moet Hennessy apparently is set to relinquish its $7.5 billion shareholding in Hermes. This is the end of the siege, Luca Solca said. The speculative appeal of Hermes, which will go as it goes back to being a normally traded company. I'll put up a photograph of pedestrians carrying their Hermes branded shopping bags as they walk along New Bond Street in London. Coming to the commodity markets, gold, I'm going to put up a 1-month chart. We're at 1271.655. We've been on the slide here because of the stronger dollar. I think it's headed to 1240. Crude oil, which had a very bad day when gold fell sharply earlier in the week, back at $94.61. I think we're seeing good support build here around 93, 94. Arabica bean prices have gone from $1.11 a pound at the start of 2014 to to $2.19 a pound in April, down to $1.61 in July, and back up again to almost $2 this August. I'll put up a chart for you to have a look at. From chocolate to beer, shrinkflation is unseen pressure. Inflation may be lurking in the aisles of the supermarkets, even with price pressures tame to non-existent in the industrial world. Economist Pippa Malmgren says that there, if you look, she's calling it shrinkflation, where companies charge consumers the same or more for less. And she's saying that may foreshadow an overall jump in prices, an alarm she's been sounding for a while. Coming to Africa, I was struck by this tweet from the President's office in Burundi: Clôture du flambeau de la paix. La flamme qui a sillonné toute la province a été éteinte en Ngozi. And you can see the President holding this flame of peace, and that's a constructive signal, we all hope. Renamo leader Dhlakama to come out of hiding to meet the Mozambique President. Come out of hiding today, return to the capital Maputo for face-to-face talks with the country's president. The meeting on Friday with President Armando Guebuza is aimed at cementing a peace deal, ending 2 years of armed conflict and allowing Dhlakama to make a late start in campaigning for presidential elections in October. We invite our members, sympathizers, admirers, and the population in general to join us in welcoming President Dhlakama on Thursday afternoon at the Maputo International Airport, said Renama's spokesman. He disappeared from public life in October 2012, relocating to a remote bush camp in central Mozambique. And on the 2nd of June, I wrote how Mozambique could be the next Qatar. I took a photograph this year as the evening light fell over the Indian Ocean, looking out to sea. And I took another photograph when we visited about 3 years ago from the sea, looking back at Maputo as the sun set up, put that up as well. South African all shares up 11.907% in 2014, rallied 0.64% yesterday, and is now less than 1% below a record high set on the 29th of July. Dollar rand, little bit firmer, 1068.73, but still very much in that range about which I've been speaking for a while. The interestingly HSBC Purchasing Managers Index rose to 51.1 in August, from 46.4 in July. And when I visited with Jaguar Land Rover and I had a look around, and I thought it's trundling along at the bottom, it's not going lower, it's going to bounce eventually, and I still stand by that view. Egyptian pound 715, the Egyptian stock market up a marginal 0.04%, but up a monster 41.949% this year. Nigerian all share is at 10-week lows. It's negative 0.295% this year. The Ghana Stock Exchange up 2.797% this year, but at 7-month lows. When you account for the currency, you've really been hammered. It's spiraling out of control. The situation is bad, and it looks like it's going to get worse quickly. This is the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention Director Tom Frieden speaking to NBC News. I'll put up a photograph of health workers waiting to screen travelers for fever and other symptoms of Ebola at a checkpoint on the road between Freetown and Kanema in Sierra Leone, and it doesn't lend me any confidence when I look at the equipment and the state of things there. Ebola is now spreading from the remote provinces and into the teeming cities such as Freetown, where 1.2 million people jostle for space. The thought of Ebola taking hold in a major city such as Freetown or Monrovia is a virological nightmare, which is what I wrote about and said before. Everyone is scared, even I am scared, said Michael Karoma, a gynecologist. Apparently, according to the Washington Post, nearly half of Sierra Leone's Ebola cases have been found in the rural Kailahu district. Put up a photograph of that. We now learn that more than 3,500 people have been infected by the virus since the first documented cases in December. More than 1,900 people have died. If you haven't had a chance to look at that Al Jazeera Inside story I participated in, that link is on YouTube. I'd like to thank Laura for having me on that show. And I go back to the point I wrote about, saying that viruses exhibit non-linear and exponential characteristics. And I don't think we've hit that non-linear exponential stage yet. 6 months into the worst Ebola epidemic in history, the world is losing the battle to contain it, said Liu at a UN forum. In Sierra Leone, she said infectious bodies are rotting in the streets. Liberia had to build a new crematorium instead of new Ebola care centers. The outbreak is advancing ahead of us, and we in our control efforts are falling behind, Nabarro of WHO said. Alex DeWala, and I just saw the headline, has written a book, and I think it's called When Kleptocracy Becomes Insolvent, Brute Causes of the Civil War in South Sudan. And he seemed very accurate. South Sudan obtained independence in July 2011 as a kleptocracy, a militarized, corrupt, neo-patrimonial system of governance. By the time of independence, South Sudanese political marketplace was so expensive that the country's comparatively copious revenue was consumed by the military political patronage system, with almost nothing left for public services development or institution building. The efforts of national technocrats and foreign donors produced bubbles of institutional integrity, but the system as a whole was entirely resistant to reform. The January 2012 shutdown of oil production bankrupted the system. Even a skilled political business manager would have struggled, and President Salva Kiir did not display the required skills. No sooner had shots been fired than the compact holding, the SPLA together, fell apart, and civil war ensued. Stratfor put out an interesting infographic of Angola oil production from 1965 to 2013, and in that infographic you can understand the wealth of the president's family and himself. WEF have put out an infographic showing what are the most competitive economies in sub-Saharan Africa. African Home Strings have written about top property markets in Africa. Andrew Golding, who's this group CEO, Pam Golding, asked which African countries have the best opportunity for property investors. He says East African country had its own specific dynamics and opportunities. Mozambique is the flavor of the month at the moment. Due to its booming resources center, there is a lot of activity across all the segments of the property sector, with cranes dominating the skyline of Maputo. One can find upmarket leisure developments just south of Maputo that cost $10 million a unit. 2 years ago, this would have been unthinkable. Talking about Nairobi, the buy-to-let culture, Nairobi, strong residential markets, Lusaka, Namibia, Zimbabwe, Swaziland. I'm a big bull about African real estate in point of fact. Obviously, lots of beta, you've got to be in the right place at the right time, but broadly, I forecast, for example, in Kenya, we've had a 3.24 times return over the last 10 years. I think we're going to have something similar over the next 10. Kenya shilling was at 88.69, just below that key level of 89. I, for one, so far am not prepared to buy the plus 90, plus 95 forecast. I think its confounded expectations will confound it again. I think recent weakness was driven by a very high crude oil price. That's turned around, and I think that's going to give the shilling some respite. Nairobi All Share up 12.263%, has closed at a record high for 8 consecutive sessions. Going back to that comment I used of Partridge's, well, this is a bull market, The NSE 20 climbed to 6-year high. I said the key catalyst for the rally has been foreign investors who have continued to upsize exposure to blue chip stocks. Interestingly, in 2014, we've also seen small and medium-sized cap stocks attract demand, I said. I'm expecting a minimum objective for the NSE 20 of 5,400 before the end of the year. Safaricom closed at a record. It's closed at a record every day this week. It's up 23.502% this year. And I caught Bob dancing to Kunle Ayo yesterday. I took a photograph and I think it's dancing a celebratory dance given the performance of the share price. Kenya Commercial Bank, that's up 23.809% this year and at a record high as well. And Kenya Orchards, which is a tiny little tiddler of a stock, but it's rallied 511%. Just think about that. SPG Securities, which is run by my friend Corey Gamba Mobessa, topped the stockbrokers' profit charts, and I'll put up a photograph of him and I when I went to their investor relations conference on the beach on the south coast. As I said, the Nairobi All shares closed at a record for 8 consecutive sessions. Let's see if we can make it 9 today. It's up 17.263%. The NSE 20 is at a 6-year high. Bull extension looked a little bit tired yesterday, and a small correction is probably overdue. Let's see how things develop. NSE 20 IPO was oversubscribed by 664%, and I expect a meaningful price spike there. Once again, thank you so much for stopping by.